This last section on factoring has to do with factoring trinomials of the form ax squared plus bx plus c, where we actually have something other than 1 in the place where a goes. So we're going to factor trinomials first using the trial and check method. Truthfully, I don't love the trial and check method, but I do understand that it's the quickest way to get to an answer. So sometimes lightning strikes and you're going to get the right answer that way. But I definitely recommend going to the grouping method and using the way that we see at the end of this lecture as your main way of solving these types of problems. Guess and check is going to work sometimes, but sometimes you're going to sit there and guess and never get to where you want to end up. If you follow the steps in the grouping method, it should be a quicker path to where you want to go. So, where we're going to start is by looking at the type of trinomials that we're creating. So here, if I do 2x plus 1 times x plus 3, 2x times x gives me 2x squared, 2x times 3 gives me 6x, and so on. It all ends up being 2x squared plus 7x plus 3. If I instead switch the 3 and the 1 and do 2x plus 3 times x plus 1, there my middle term ends up being slightly different and gives me 5x instead of 7x. So when we look at what's the same for each of these both have the same first terms, 2x and x, 2x and x. They both have the same numbers being multiplied at the end, 1 and 3. They're just in different positions. So we can see what that leads to is we still get the same thing multiplied 1 and 3 gets me to 3. We still get the same thing multiplied 2x times x gets me 2x squared. So those stay the same. The only thing that changes when we switch those two positions is what the middle number combines to. And the reason that changes is here this 3 is only being multiplied by 1x. Here this 3 is being multiplied by 2x. So you get 6x when you do it this way. You get 3x when you do it this way. The other multiplication then here, it's really 1 times x is 1x. Here, 1 times 2x is 2x. So this slight change only changes this middle number, which kind of just leads us into the idea that if it's easy enough to see what the first and last thing should multiply to, it might be as easy as checking 2 or 3 different ways it can be arranged to see which one gets you to the proper end product. So in each case, the first terms are the same, the last terms are the same, only the middle terms are different here. So the fact that only the middle terms change might be helpful when doing the trial and check method. If I went to factor 2x squared plus 5x plus 3, I could start by saying that since it's going to be the product of two binomials, we know that they have to start with 2x and x, because that's the only way to multiply the 2x squared. We also know that at the end, we have to fill in with two things that will factor to 3. So two things that will multiply to 3, I should say. Only way to multiply to 3 is 3 and 1. So we already know that 2x times x has to be the first spots. We know that 3 and 1 have to be the last spots, but we're not sure which one goes where. What we can do is just try it both ways. Plug in the 1 and 3, plug in the 3 and 1, and see which one works out right. If our goal is to get 5x in the middle, then we'll see that it's when we write it this way, with the plus 3 with the 2x and the plus 1 with the 1x, that's the way we get to where we want to head. Again, I don't love this method. I do think it's somewhat worthwhile when you're starting with something that has limited ways to multiply to it, like this 2x squared at the start, like this 3 at the end. So there are uses for it, but honestly, you have to get lucky for it to work. The other method that we're going to learn, the grouping method, is much more rigorous and much more easy to apply to any possible problem. So, write the trinomial in descending powers of the variable, factor out the greatest common factor, then attempt to write 2 factors of the first term, 2 factors of the last term, and see if when you multiply back, you get to where you wanted to end up, which is the original multiplication. So sometimes we'll have to factor trinomials after factoring out the greatest common factor. For instance here, 2x squared minus 8x cubed plus 3x. In this case, I can take an x out of everything. So I can take an x out of this x squared term, I can take an x out of this x cubed term, I can take an x out of this 3x term. That said, if I do that, the highest power of x, x squared, would be here with a negative 8. I really don't want my first term to be negative, so probably I would take out, instead of just an x, a negative x, to ensure that first term was a positive x squared term. So, we first write it in descending powers, negative 8x cubed plus 2x squared plus 3x. I'd love to take a negative 8 out, but 8 doesn't go into either 2 and 3. More so, no factors of 8 go into both 2 and 3. So that 8's got to stay there. That said, I see there's at least one x in each term, so an x can come out. And again, I want to make this first term positive, so since it's negative currently, I'm going to take out a negative x. Taking out a negative x really means I'm going to divide each of these 3 terms by negative x. When I divide negative 8x cubed by negative x, the negatives go away, 1x goes away, and I'm left with positive 8x squared. When I divide 2x squared by negative x, I'm left with negative 2x. And when I divide positive 3x by negative x, I'm left with negative 3. So as you can see, pulling out the negative x leaves me with 8x squared minus 2x minus 3. My goal now is to factor the trinomial 8x squared minus 2x minus 3. I know the only ways to get to minus 3 are multiplying negative 1 and positive 3, or negative 3 and positive 1, so that's not so bad. 8x squared is a little trickier because there's 2 different ways to get there, either 4x times 2x, or 8x times 1x. So, we see that these are the 2 possible ways that we could write it. Now that we have those 2 possible ways, we're going to fill in with either negative 1, positive 3, or negative 3, positive 1, or any combination therein for each of the 2. We're looking for the one that will give us negative 2x, so it turns out of those 8 possibilities that we'd have to check, the one that actually works is 2x plus 1, 4x minus 3. It works because all we have to really check is that middle term. We know that 2x times 4x gives me 8x squared. We know the positive 1 times the negative 3 gives me negative 3. What we're checking is that 2x times 3x gives me negative 6x. 4x times 1 gives me positive 4x. When I combine them, those do get me to my middle term of negative 2x. So again, in this trial and check method, I would have had to write out the 8 possibilities, start multiplying them out. When I get to one that works out the way that I'd like, I say, yes, this is the correct one, and I check it off. So the final factored form here of the inside trinomial is 2x plus 1 times 4x minus 3. But remember, we factored out a negative x. So the overall original equation, in its fully factored form, has the negative x out front. And then we're going to change this 8x squared minus 2x minus 3 into this factored form of 2x plus 1, 4x minus 3. Again, we can check this by multiplication and see that yes, we do go back to where we started. The real method that I like is this factoring trinomials using the grouping method. I call it the cross method just because I draw a cross where I put in this x cross, if you will. On top, I put what they multiply to. On bottom, I put what they add to. And then I try and find the 2 numbers. You don't need to make the x cross the way that I'm going to in the classwork videos in order to get the right answers. It's just a method that I've seen that works for students, so it's the way that I like to teach. That said, the larger idea here of the grouping method is if we start out with something like 2x squared plus 5x plus 3, we want to figure out what we need to multiply to and what we need to add to. So to figure out what we need to multiply to, we take the first term times the last term. 2 times 3 gives me 6, which is going to be my key number for AC. So the same way when we did grouping, we started with the last term C and called it our key number. It was because we were taking that last term and multiplying it by an understood 1, where anything times 1 is itself. Here, we're multiplying it by what's ever in front of the x squared term. So here our key number is 2 times 3 equals 6. We then need to consider the b the same way we have in the past, which is just what's the coefficient on the middle term. The b in this case is 5. So we're looking for two things that multiply to 6 and add to 5. 2 times 3 multiplies to 6. 2 plus 3 adds to 5. We now know we can break up this 5x into a positive 2x and a positive 3x, because 2 and 3 were my factors for multiplication and for addition. Once I have it broken up like that, now I can use the factor by grouping formula, which says group the first two together, factor out the greatest common factor. Group the last two together, factor out the greatest common factor. If you've properly identified the greatest common factor that comes out, then you'll be left with the same parentheses afterwards. 2x goes into both 2x squared and 2x. When I divide 2x squared by 2x, I'm left with x. When I divide 2x by itself, I'm left with a positive 1. 3 is the largest thing that can come out of 3x plus 3. When I divide 3x plus 3, I get x. When I divide 3 by 3, I get 1. So this x plus 1 is the correct repeated factor. I can now write the final factor by grouping as outsides 2x plus 3 times that repeated inside x plus 1. I can verify that it's correct by just multiplying these out, but it would get me back to the correct final answer. So when you're trying the factoring by grouping for them, they want you to write the trinomial in descending powers of the variable. What that just means is largest power of the variable first, on down to the lowest power of the variable. So start with your x squared term, then single power of x, then no power of x. If there's higher powers of x involved, you probably have to factor something out before you begin, but basically make sure eventually it's written from largest to smallest. Calculate the key number AC, meaning multiply the first term by the last term. Again, make sure that you factor out a negative if you have a leading term that's negative. Find two numbers whose product is the key number, a times c, that you found in step 2, and whose sum is the coefficient of the middle term. They write it as blanks, like ax squared blank x plus blank x plus c. Again, I'm going to write it as a little x where I fill in the top, bottom, and then get two numbers on the sides that multiply to the top and combine or add to the bottom. Check the factorization using multiplication. So let's say we have 10x squared plus 13x minus 3. First thing I'm going to check is that the first term is positive. It is, so I don't need to factor out a negative 1. Next thing I'm going to check is if anything divides evenly into all three numbers. In this case, both 13 and 3 are prime, so nothing's going to divide in evenly. I now know that it's time for me to create my cross and define my factor by grouping answers for the two middle terms. When I make this cross, on top is going to be my key number AC. 10 times negative 3 gives me negative 30. On bottom is going to be my middle term number, or B13, so at the bottom of the cross would be a 13. I have negative 30 on top, I have a positive 13 on bottom. That tells me I'm looking for two numbers, one negative, one positive, that when I multiply them will give me 30. I then want to combine those two numbers. Since one's negative, one's positive, it's going to be subtraction, and it should give me a positive 13. Since this middle term is positive, it means that the larger of the two numbers is going to be the one that's positive. That way, when I combine them, a larger positive with a smaller negative is going to give me a positive result. So I think of the different ways to multiply to 30. I have 1 times 30, but when I do 30 minus 1, I get 19. Or I'm sorry, I get 29, which is now 13. I then have 2 times 15. When I do 15 minus 2, I do get 13, so that is the correct answer. I could also try 10 and 3, which would give me 7 is incorrect. I could try 6 and 5, which would give me 1 is incorrect. So of the 4 possible ways to multiply to 30, the one that gives me 13 when I subtract the two numbers really, is 15 and 2. So what that's all told me is that once I have everything in place, that I want something that multiplies to negative 30 and combines to 13, I'll get the two factors 15 and negative 2. The whole process of finding this 15 and negative 2 is complicated, especially if I get a really big key number that has a lot of different ways to multiply to it. But basically, once I get to this step, it's now just become a factor by grouping problem. So I can take what used to be 13x and split it into 15 and negative 2. Instead of writing it like this, I would write 10x squared plus 15x minus 2x minus 3. Once it's written like that, now I can apply my factor by grouping. The first two terms, I can put 5x into each of them. The last two terms, really there's nothing that goes into both 2x and into 3, but I see that I want to take a negative out so that they're both positive results, like what I'm going to get in the first one when I factor out my 5x. So if I take a 5x out of the first group, 10x squared divided by 5x leaves me with 2x. 15x divided by 5x leaves me with 3. So this becomes 5x times 2x plus 3. If I hadn't realized to take a negative 1 out of this and I got negative 2x minus 3, hopefully that would show me that when I compare it to the first parentheses, something went wrong. Hold on, these are negative, these are positive. Is there a way I could make a match? Yes, I could take a negative 1 out of these two. So if you do take a negative 1 out, negative 2x divided by negative 1 gives me positive 2x. Negative 3 divided by negative 1 gives me positive 3. So I have this repeated factor, 2x plus 3. On the insides, I have on the outside 5x minus 1. That means in my factor by grouping, it should be outsides times insides. 5x minus 1 times 2x plus 3. I can check back. When I multiply these out, I do get back to 10x squared plus 13x minus 3. I highly recommend you watch the classwork video on these, see me work through a bunch of them because they definitely are complicated, especially again when you have a lot of different ways to multiply to the available AC.